Today's daf we're going to be learning is Gittin daf mem aleph. Remind everyone that we've already announced that we're having a trip to Poland. We're going to have Siyum Seder Nashim in Poland at the end of October, beginning of November. It's a women's only trip. Hope to see you all there. We've already gotten a lot of registered people. We have a maximum of 40, so there's about 10 spots left. So if people want to join, I would recommend registering soon. And I'll also remind people that the Siyum for Masechet Gittin will be on August 13th in Atlantic Beach. It'll be a live Siyum there. So if anyone's in the New York area and wants to join, there'll be a Siyum Hashas of 2 women there, which will be very exciting. And I'm inviting you all to come. Or it will be on Zoom, so you can join on Zoom or live. Okay, let's get started with our daf. We have this very difficult Mishnah to understand, and we're going to see it's one of these great cases where almost every word in this Mishnah is going to be understood in 2 different ways. Okay, so I'll just try to read the Mishnah again without really any explanation, and with it, maybe, I'll use he just because it's a little easier here than she, but we're going to basically kind of use pronouns to make it clear how unclear this Mishnah is. Okay, here it's clear who we're talking about. We have a slave. The slave was used by his owner. The owner took out a loan. Let's say I took out a loan from you. I said, if I can't pay back the money, take my slave. Or alternatively, it's not clear. There's 2 kinds of apotiki. Or I said, you will collect the loan from the slave and only from the slave. Okay, so he was, either which way he was designated for this loan, whether it was just as if I don't pay back or really designated for the loan. And then shifruro. Then somebody frees the slave. Already we don't know who. Somebody frees the slave. Shurat adin ena eved chayav klum. The basic law is that eved doesn't require anything. Aman daf mem amud bet still from yesterday. But mipnei tikkun olam kofin et rabo va'oseh oto ben chorin. Because of tikkun olam, which we don't yet know what the tikkun olam is here, the betterment of the world, literally. Kofin et rabo, we force his master to free him. V'kotev shtar, we don't know yet which master, because theoretically he sort of has 2 masters, because you're also somewhat in charge of the slave now that I dedicate the slave toward this loan, even though you're not really the master, but you're somewhat a master. And that's what causes the confusion here. And in this case, according to tana, kamma kotev shtar al damav, that means the eved himself he gets freed a second time, but he has to pay his way out, basically. He has to pay for his freedom. Rabban Shimon Gamliel omer eno kotev al meshachrer. The slave doesn't have to do it. The person who freed him, who we don't yet know who this is, has to pay his way. So let's try to figure out what's going on. So eved shasel rabo apotiki v'shechuro. We're going back to the Gemara from yesterday. Mi shechuro. So first we're going to have Rav, then we're going to have Ulla. 2 very different explanations of this Mishnah. Rabo rishon. So Rav's going to start with the first one who freed him is his owner, and then we said, what's the story? Rabba says, well, hekdesh chametz and shikra mafki'im midei shi'abud. So even though I designated this slave for the loan, the fact that I freed him now removes the lien on him. He's no longer lien to you. Done. There's no lien. What's the problem? Now we're finally on today's daf. Since the second one, you who was promised this slave, you know what slave you were promised. You go to the shuk, you see this slave. Now, either you know he was freed or you don't know he was freed. It almost doesn't matter. Because even if you know he was freed, you're annoyed by the fact that he's freed. And you start saying, that's my eved. He's mine. Okay? So you start pointing at the eved. And then it's a problem. Why is it a problem? Well, Rashi points out, Yotzi laz al banav. People are going to start saying, this guy's kids are slaves. And once people start bad-mouthing you and saying, why do I say bad-mouthing? It's not great to be a slave. And this certainly with your marital status, it's a problem. Slaves can't marry regular Jews. They can marry mamzerim. Okay, that's, then you're only going to make mamzerim. So we don't want people calling you a slave when you're not a slave. It's going to create a whole problem for marriages down the road for all your children and your children's children. And it'll keep going on. So we don't want people calling him Eved on the street. Creates a bad rap for him. Therefore, kofinit rabo sheni. Now we understand. No, you're not really the owner of the slave, and I've already freed the slave, so he's not even a slave anymore. But in order to prevent you from going on the street saying he's a slave, it still doesn't prevent you, by the way. It's just a deterrent. once you've gone to court or wherever you did this and you gave him an emancipation document and said you're no longer a slave and you free whatever rights you claim to have in him, even though you really don't have any rights to him, because we already said the fact that I freed him already means he's free of any responsibility to you. But we force you anyway to free him. And you make him a completely free person without any claims on him. And even if you would sort of say he was an Eved in the street, at least he could bring a document that says, I'm not your slave, because look, you gave me a shtar shifur, and he could clear his name. But what's the issue? In order for the slave to get this, he has to pay something for this. And that's kotev eved shtar al damav. Well, the malveh shouldn't lose out on his loan, right? And in the end, you don't have a way to collect your money. So when he does this action of freeing the slave, it comes with a commitment of the slave that he'll pay his way for this freedom. In other words, he's gaining something, but he has to pay for it. And that way the malveh gets his money back also, or her money back. Rashbag omer, eina eved kotev ela meshachar kotev. No. And exactly what you're saying, Tina. Rashbag says, no, the person who freed him has to pay, meaning me. I owe this money. I freed my slave. Very nice that I can do this, but I'm responsible for the damages I caused you. I have to pay you the value of the slave. Okay, so what's the root of the machloket? This is a type of what we call indirect damages. There's different types of indirect damages, sort of depending on how indirect they are. There's garma, there's garmi, there's whole sugyot about this. This is a case of indirect damages upon which there's a machloket. I freed my slave. I did some action. I wasn't damaging you. We don't know why I was doing it. It almost doesn't matter what the intent is, because when it comes to damages, the intent is not important. But the point is I did an action that is independent of the damages it caused you. I wanted to free my slave. Now, it happens it caused you damages. So that's indirect, even though it's kind of direct, because as soon as I did that, it caused you damages because now you can't collect your loan. This makes more sense, by the way, if we say that our agreement was you're only going to collect it from the slave, and it was that type of apotiki. And then you really have no way to collect your loan, or it could be in a case where I have nothing else to give you. So in that case, basically what we're going to say is, I caused you indirect damages. Am I responsible or not? That's a machloket. Since it's indirect damages, there's a debate about whether I'm responsible or not. According to Rashbag, I'm obviously responsible, and that's why I have to pay. According to takana, I'm not responsible. But the malveh somehow has to get his money, and because he's freeing the slave is going to have to commit to pay for the loan. Okay? And that's how the machloket works. It's hard to understand why the slave has to really pay his way out. He already got freed. It's a little weird. A little hard to understand, but that's the Tanakh. It's also a weakness in this interpretation, I would say, because the slave really isn't responsible to pay his way out, even though he is gaining something from this, but still he's not gaining his whole value. He already got his freedom. Anyway, Itmar Nami, it was said like this, okay, meaning we have a statement that supports this reading. Hamazik shi'abudo shel chavero, if you damage the lien of someone else, which by the way, could be this kind of scenario, where you're the one who owes the money and you damage the lien somehow, or you do something to it. Or it could be you damage someone, like, for example, the classic example given here is you won't, let's say in the same case, so I owe you money, you take your promissory note and you sell it to a friend. And then you come to me and you say, listen, you don't have to pay me back the money. And now I don't have to pay back your friend the money. So you damaged by canceling the loan, you damaged your friend who you basically sold the property to. Now, it seems a little crazy, but this is called indirect damages, and there's a machloket. So, they say in the statement, Banu machloket, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, Rabbanan. This machloket of Rashbag and Rabbanan is exactly that machloket. Okay, and that supports the reading that that's the root of the debate here. Ulla has a totally different explanation, starting from the very first line. Mi shichruro, when it says, right, of evet shaso rabo apotiki lachiri v'shichruro. This is a good example in, right, that the subject was the Eved who I made an apotiki for my loan with you. And we thought Shichuro meant, and I freed him. But now the Shichuro is, and you freed him, Rabo Sheni, you freed him. Now this is strange. He's not yours to free. How did you free him? So the way the Mishnah is going to read is like this. Now, remember we had before, the next line was, Shurat hadin ein ha'eved chayav klum. Now, what we said that meant was, by the letter of the law, according to the first reading, the Eved doesn't know anybody anything. He got his freedom from the first master. He shouldn't have to pay his way for the second master. But the Tikkun Olam says, in order to save him from bad-mouthing and saying he's an Eved, right, we basically make him pay his way out. And he gets his freedom document, but he has to pay his way out. In this case, chayav is not going to be money. What is chayav? Very interesting. Ein ha'eved chayav klum b'mitzvot. This Eved is not really freed, because who's the owner? I'm the owner. It's true, he's leaned to you for the loan, but he's not yours right now. So you have no rights to free him. So the fact that you freed him is irrelevant. What does it mean irrelevant? It means this Eved is not obligated by mitzvah. What do you mean? All Evedim have to do mitzvah, remember? They belong to a Jewish household, they keep mitzvot, but they're exempt from time-bound mitzvah. So this Eved does not have to do all the time-bound mitzvot that slaves are exempt from, because this Eved is still, this slave is still a slave. They're not a free person at all. Okay, so therefore what happens? So what? Well, kofin et rabo, elam mipnei tikkun haolam, sha'arei yatsa alav shem ben chorin. But wait, there's a bit of a problem. The same way that he wasn't really a slave in the first case, but you were going to claim he was a slave. He's not really free in this case. But we're worried that people will think he's free because they'll see that he got freed by someone. They might not know all the details, who freed him, and was this document of emancipation valid or not valid. It wasn't valid because you didn't own him. But people sort of think he's a free person because there's some redemption that went on there. Therefore, what's the problem? Well, the problem is unclear exactly what the problem is. But first of all, it looks like I have a slave who's not really a slave. It looks like he's not doing mitzvot, right? He's not doing mitzvot, right? He's not doing all the mitzvot that, let's say, he's not wearing tefillin. We talked about the tefillin before. He's not doing it. So people see him and they say, oh, why is this guy not wearing tefillin? Why is he not doing this? People will start saying, look at this person. He became Jewish, but he's not really Jewish, right? He's not doing the things that Jewish people are supposed to do. And that will not be good for the slave, right? It's an interesting issue here that the slave is going to start being bad-mouthed. And in the previous one, he was being bad-mouthed because he was a slave. In this case, he's being bad-mouthed because he's not a slave, but kind of acting like a slave, even though he really is a slave. But people don't know that. And therefore, kofinet rabo b'oseo ben chorin. So rabo rishon, kofinet rabo rishon. So now we force, because people are looking at him as if he's a ben chorin, it doesn't look good that he's kind of a slave, but also a free person. So we force me, the original owner, to free him entirely, to free him legitimately, fair and square. V'kotev shtar al damav, but there's no, now what's the shtar al damav? Well, I get the value now, but what value do I get? Now remember, he was leaned to this other person. So what money do I lose out here? Let's say my loan was for $1,000 and the slave was worth $1,200. So I'm basically owed $200 there. So the Eved has to give me, when I give him his freedom, and my loan was only $1,000. Now my loan never has to be repaid because you, who were supposed to collect the loan, freed the slave who was supposed to count for your loan. So I don't have to repay this loan anymore, but I shouldn't have to pay an extra $200. So the $200 comes back to me by the slave. Since the slave got his freedom and the loan wasn't repaid through him, I at least get back my $200. Rashbag omer eno kotev ela mishacher kotev. The slave doesn't have to give me back the $200 extra. You, as the malveh, who basically said, I don't really care about my loan anymore, and freed my slave and caused me to have to free my slave. Well, you caused me a loss of $200, so you have to pay me the $200 because you caused me damages. What's the root of the machloket? This is a fascinating issue that's going to come up in a bunch of dapim, which is, here it comes up on Nun Gimel. It's called damages that are not seen. Okay, the classic examples are, you offer up my wine to idols. Okay, this is Yein Nesech, right? It's a big issue. If you offer my wine up to idols, now my wine looks exactly the same. It doesn't look any different. Or you make my truma impure and you ruin it, but it looks the same. It doesn't like it. It's not like it has a big stain on it. You can't really see that it's impure, but it is impure. There's a whole question about whether this is actually called damages or not, which is interesting. If you thought indirect damages was strange, that it would be called, whether you would call this damages or not, you still cause damages. This is even more strange. You actually cause damage, but since you can't see it, maybe you're not actually responsible for paying damages for this. So now, when you freed my slave, which wasn't yours to free, you didn't really do anything, but you did cause me to have to free my slave and cause me this loss of money. So therefore, but it's not any noticeable damage. The slave is still a slave. So the question is this called damages or not? Some people make distinctions, say this maybe is more noticeable damages because people do know like who's a slave, who's not a slave. And maybe you would be, if you had a scale, it would be closer to noticeable rather than not noticeable. But still, it's not really, his body looks exactly the same. There's no change. So Mar Savar Shmei Hezek, right? So my kamiflage, Behezek she'eno nikar kamiflage. That's the root of the machloket, according to this interpretation. Mar Savar Shmei Hezek, Umar Savar Lo Shmei Hezek. So if you hold it is damages, that's Rashbag, the second opinion. That Rashbag is saying the malva has to pay me because they caused me, the creditor has to pay me, they caused me damages. But the other opinion says no, so then who has to pay me? Well, then the eved has to compensate me, right? The eved is the default. If no one else, then the slave, since the slave in the end is getting freedom for nothing, basically. So therefore, they end up having to pay. Ulla, my time alone, Amar. So now we're going to have why didn't each one hold like the other? What was the weakness? Amar Lacha, Sheni Rabo Karitle. He says, how could you say that when it says at the end of the Mishnah, Kofin et Rabo, or toward the end of the Mishnah, we force the master to free him? Well, Ulla has a better interpretation. Who's the master? I'm the master, not you. So in the first interpretation, it was you, but you're not the master. How can we call you the master? You never owned the slave. And Ulam, Rab, my time alone, Marku Ulla. So why didn't Rab hold like the second interpretation? Sheni Meshakra Karitle. When it says at the end, Rabban Shimon Gamliel says, Eino Kotev Ela Meshakra, the one who freed him, or even in the beginning, Vishichro, he frees him. Who can free if not the master? And how could you possibly say someone else is freeing him when they're not even the owner of him? It doesn't make any sense. So as we said, there's weaknesses to both opinions. There's a hard, right? It's a hard mission to explain. Itmar. Now, if we're already talking about apotiki, we now have a different explanation. Just again, maybe I should do a quick review of what the tikkun olam is, right? So according to the first interpretation, the tikkun olam is to make sure this slave doesn't end up with a bad name on the street and people call his sons slaves when they're not really slaves, or call him a slave and make it hard for them to get married, which is going to connect with the next tikkun olam, by the way, in the next Mishnah. And according to the second interpretation, the tikkun olam is to allow him to keep mitzvot, which also, by the way, connects with the next Mishnah. Okay, so it's a little different, but sort of in the best interest of the slave, right? So they're both kind of protecting the slave, but also from people saying things about them that are negative and all that. So if somebody designates their field to be returned for a loan, and then a river comes, a stream, and ruins the whole field. Ami Shapir Na'eh, it's an interesting name, Ami the Beautiful, Amar Rabbi Yochanan says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Eino Goveh Mishar Nechasim. You can't collect it from other property. The father of Shmuel says, of course you collect it from other property. What do you mean? Just because I made it in apotiki doesn't mean. So Amar Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak, Mishum Dami Shapir Na'eh Womer Shmata Delo Shapiran, because he's so beautiful, right? But yet he's saying something that's not so beautiful, meaning it doesn't really make too much sense. To Targum Shmate, I'm going to explain what he said. There's really no debate here. The issue is what is the case here? As I mentioned before, there's two different kinds of apotiki. There's apotiki where I say, I'm only paying you from this field. In that case, Ami Shapir Na'eh is correct. If it's only from this field, and that was the deal we made. You loan me money, and I said, I'm paying you only from this field. And you said, okay. And that was our deal. So if something happens to there, that's your tough luck. You don't get your money back. But what Avoid the Shmuel was talking about, which is you can collect from anything else, that's if I said, if I don't pay you back, you can collect from this field. But if something happens to the field, obviously you collect from somewhere else. So then they don't really disagree. And in fact, Tanya Namihach, here's a bright to support this reading. How apotiki lachel, exactly this case, and the stream comes and washes it out, ruins it. You can collect from other property. But if he said, Lo this is the only place this is the only thing you can use to collect the loan, then you can't collect from anywhere else. So that is exactly the proof of what we said. There's really no machloket here between what they quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Ami Shapir Na'eh, and what Avodah Shmuel said. They were just each talking in different situations. Tanya Idach, another Braita. Apotiki lebal chov. You make your field, the collection, right, for either a bal chov, that's a classic case of a loan, or someone who owes money, ulik tubat isha, going back to the ketubah of a woman, that you can collect, right? If I don't pay you the money, you can collect it from this field. You can collect from other property as well. Rashbag wants to make a distinction between the tubat isha and a regular bal chov. He says, bal chov goveh mishar nechasim. Isha ena gova mishar nechasim. A bal chov can collect from other property, but the woman can't collect from anywhere else. What this means is, let's say he sold the field that he promised to me for my ketubah. I can go directly and collect that field. Okay. If I'm a bal chov and he sold the field and he has other fields, I go to the other fields. Okay. Even if he sold them all, what are the rules? The rules are if the creditor the debtor sold a lot of property, I have to go figure out, when I go collect the loan, I have to figure out I have to go to the courts, figure out which one was sold last and which is the one that I actually collect from them, because I collect from the one that was last. Okay, that's how it works. We've seen this before. So if you have 5 pieces of property and you sold one in January, one in February, one in March, one in April, one in May, the last one you've had in your possession is the one I go to. So I go to the one in May and I collect it from him. So now they say they're going to distinguish male, female. Why there's difference here? So they say the woman doesn't have to go find who bought last in May. She can just go, let's say you sold this property that was, again, designated for her to collect. You can go there straight away, even though he sold that one in January. Why? This could be understood in many different ways. Either it's a gender thing. Women in those days, it wasn't appropriate to have them go to the court and start clarifying all these things and figuring out who bought last. And it's a pain, right? And it's not sanua, not modest for women to go to the court and start dealing with these things. Maybe. Possibly you could say women didn't have time in those days. They were busy cooking, cleaning, taking care of the kids, right? How they're going to start going to court with their kids in tow. And it just wasn't appropriate for a woman to do that kind of thing because she had other responsibilities. It could be, maybe she'd have a hard time. We saw women who had a hard time in court, right? I mean, women do go to court. We know that. But we saw a case not so long ago. But maybe, we don't want them to start getting into fights about the money, and maybe they're not assertive enough. Maybe it's just hard for them to do this, and therefore we're going to make it easier. Or maybe this has to do, now notice, by the way, they didn't compare a creditor who's a male and a creditor who's a female. They compared a ketubah of a woman to a regular creditor. It could be that what they mean is collecting your ketubah specifically, because if you remember, we saw in some cases that they want to make it easier for the woman. We're going to see this actually coming up in the next section, in the next chapter, that they want to make it easy for the woman to collect her ketubah. Okay, there's different opinions of why, but one of the reasons is, right, to make it a little easier for the woman so that she'll want to get married, she'll know she's protected, and perhaps that's why they just made it easier. And they kind of say it in those words, but maybe it's specifically ketubah. It's a good question, because maybe it's any woman that's a bal chov, right? If you say it's just a male-female distinction, it doesn't have to do with the ketubah, then this law would apply across the board. And it's not so clear, because it does distinguish here specifically ketubah isha. So there's again, lack of clarity here. Today is one of those sugyas. In general, we're going to have lots of different opinions about kind of everything we see. So let's review this section before we move on to the next Mishnah. We had this Mishnah about a tikkun olam, about kind of, there were sort of 2 masters, not really, but the Eved was designated as a loan. And then the question was, what happened here? Who freed the slave that caused the tikkun olam? In other words, what situation even causes this tikkun olam to be? What is the tikkun olam? Who has to who redeems the slave in the end, right? Who redeemed him first, who redeemed him second, what the purpose is, and what really the machloket is about. And then we just saw some laws about apotiki in general, and now we're moving to a new Mishnah, one that we've made reference to over the last few days. Misha chetzio eved v'chetzio ben chulin. Half slave, half free. Now, until now, we always really explained it the way that we're actually going to see why we explained it this way, because the Gemara is going to conclude the very last line of today's daf is going to be, oh, don't explain it that way. Chetzio eved chetzio ben chulin is clearly someone who had two, or at least could be explained as someone who had two masters, one free, the other one didn't. So basically, according to Beit Hillel, oved rabo yom echad, v'etatzmo yom echad. So one day he works for this guy, the next day he works for himself, the next day he works for the guy who he's owned by, the next day he works for himself, and so on and so on. Every other day he's a slave, every other day he's free. Divrei Beit Hillel. Beit Shamai omrim tikantem et rabo v'etatzmo lo tikantem. This is very nice. You fixed the problem for his master, but you didn't fix him. He personally is stuck now. Why? Lisa shipcha yefshar. He can't marry a slave woman because of shikvar chetzio ben cholim, because he has a free half to him. And therefore, the part of him, right, he's like a split personality. He's got, on the one hand, he's free, and that free part of him can't marry a slave woman, a maidservant. Turning out Amabet, bat cholim yefshar, but he can't marry a regular Jewish woman, shikvar chetzio eved, because he's now half slave. Yes, so shifra charufa is exactly this, and we're going to get to shifra charufa. Okay, at least according to the way some people explain shifra charufa, she's exactly this. She's going to come up now. So therefore, yibatel, this person is going to just sit there idly doing nothing, which doesn't really mean that. It just means they won't be able to get married and have children. The whole world was created in order to procreate. Now, you would have expected them to say what? It says in the Torah, now it's alluding to the pasuk, but the pasuk that Adam and Chava commanded and Noach is commanded to have children, but Pru, Revu, Malua Ta'aretz, right? But instead they quote a pasuk from Yeshayahu, Lo tohu bra'a lashevet yitzara. The purpose of the world was not to be tohu, but lashevet yitzara. Okay, to conquer the, to live in the land and have children. So why do they say this? Perhaps because this is a more universal pasuk. It's not a commandment to the Jewish people. I mean, even Adam Rishon and Noach, you could say it was not a commandment to the Jewish people. True. It's a good question why they use this pasuk from Yeshayahu. Some of the commentaries ask about it, but it is a little bit more universal. And he's, this slave is half-half, so they're not 100% Jewish. Anyway, so come Beit Shamai and they say, in order to resolve this problem, kofin, we don't want to leave somebody, right? Number one, we want the world to continue. We want people to have children, and he's got a commandment to have children. By the way, the commentaries say this is different if she's a woman, because a woman is not commanded per. So therefore, perhaps you wouldn't do this. So basically, we force the master to free. This is Beit Shamai. What do? Well, the slave is, if we're going to force the master, just like our previous Mishnah, so the slave has to promise that over time, as he works, he needs to compensate the original owner. A fascinating Mishnah. Beit Hillel in the end agrees to Beit Shamai, and everyone agrees that you have to free the slave, okay, because of the tikkun haolam. As I mentioned, the way we understand this Mishnah usually is that they had two masters, but the Gemara is going to ask the question, is there such a thing that someone could free their slave halfway? Can you give your slave half their freedom? And that's going to be the main sugya. And in the end, they're going to say, well, if you can't, then what's our Mishnah talking about? And in the end, they'll answer, no, our Mishnah could be the way we've always understood our Mishnah, which is two masters. But originally, as a quest, or as a way of kind of proving one side over the other, they're going to first suggest maybe our Mishnah is talking about someone who freed his slave halfway. So perhaps it's another way to read the Mishnah. So now Tanu Rabbanan, Hamishachrev Chatzi Avdo, Rebbi Omer Kana, Chachamim Omrim Lo Kana. So this is a big debate between Rebbi and the rabbis, and we're going to have a whole debate, Raba and Rav Yosef, how to understand the debate Rebbi and the rabbis, in what case did they debate? So let's just start with first understanding the debate, and then we'll see how we really understand the debate. Someone who frees half of their slaves. So again, not two masters. We have one master, and they free their slave halfway. They basically said, half the week you could work for yourself, half the week you work for me. So Rebbi Omer, kana. Rebbi says this is effective. Chachamim omrim lo kana. The rabbis say this doesn't work. I'm a rabbi. So here comes the first explanation of the machloket. Now that you can free your slave with a document, you can free your slave with money. They can pay their way out. Machloket b'shtar. So Rabbi says the debate is only if I use a document. Rebbi savar. Now we're going to go to the pasuk about a shipcha harufa. Okay, so it's a confusing pasuk and how to understand it. Today we're going to really learn. It's the context is in Vayikra chapter 19 pasuk kaf. Ish ki yishkavet isha shikvat zera. The man sleeps with a woman. V'hi shivcha necharefet leish. She is a maidservant who is designated to a Jewish slave, okay, a Jewish servant kind of thing. That's an Eved Ivri. Okay, it's very different than the Eved Knani that we've been discussing. But he's allowed to cohabit with a woman who's a slave when he's in this context of a slave. It's very strange halacha, but okay. So now she's sort of designated to him. It's almost like not exactly a marriage, but while he's a slave, he has this woman who's designated to him. That's what the Torah says. Im b'kapo yavo b'kapo yetzeh. Right? If he goes in without a woman, right, he comes out without the woman. In other words, without his children. Whoever was born there stays. It's the children of the shivcha. Now it says very confusing words. Hefda lo niftata. This woman who's a shivcha was not redeemed. Okay, but it says it in the language of hefda lo niftata, which means redeemed she was not. A bit of a way of strange way of saying it. So what they're going to learn here, and this is going to really, it's going to be the basis of what they're going to talk about, but they're only going to really show it later. So I'm going to tell you now, because it says redeemed she was not, they understand here, she must have been redeemed and not redeemed. Because she was redeemed she was not, is redeemed, and she was not redeemed. And they're assuming redemption in the Torah. How do we redeem? Through money, right? Like you do pidyon maser sheni, you do it with money. So that's money. Oh, hufasha lo nitama, or she wasn't given freedom, which is a document of freedom. So the first part is talking about money, and there relates to half-half, that maybe there could be this option. Number two, you have this issue of shtar, and notice there it doesn't have the double language. It just says she wasn't freed, which there it doesn't sound like there's a half-half option. Okay, that's where we're going to get to this whole thing. Okay, I'm not going to be the end of the pasuk. It's not important for our purposes. So now, what do they say? Rabbi says, "Machloket b'shtar, de Rebbi savar hefdei lo niftata o chufsha lo nitana, maki shtar lekesef." So again, assuming hefda lo niftata is money, shtar is chufsha lo nitana is document, and since kesef has this double, you can be redeemed and also not redeemed. You can be half-half. Ma kesef ben kulo ben chetzio, just like money, you can be partially or fully redeemed. This is what you call a hekesh. Two things are juxtaposed in the pasuk. What's true for, even though it only specified that by money there's half-half, and by shtar it didn't, but shtar is mentioned next to money. They just didn't need to say it. It's obvious. It's yes. That's Rebbi. Rabbanan, gamre la meisha. Rabbanan darshan a different type of drasha, not a hekesh, but xerah shava. Xerah shava is when the same word appears in two different places, but the exact same word. We learn from one to the other. What's the la? So notice again, chufsha lo nitan la, which is about the shtar. And that's in our pasuk. And la appeared by divorce. Remember, v'katav la sefer kritu. So now what do we have? Well, can a woman get partially divorced? No. First of all, it would be ridiculous. Second of all, we learned sefer kritut. It has to be something that completely separates between them. She can't be half-half. So therefore he says, ma isha chetzia lo, af eved nami chetzia lo. So since the part that's talking about the shtar says the word la, when it comes to a document, being free by a document, there's no such thing as half-half. It's learned from document of a get. About kesef, but by money, even Rebbi would agree. Divrei kol kana, it works. Why? P'duya ve'ena p'duya, because of the pasuk. Because it says she's redeemed and she's also not redeemed. So it must work by money, but not by shtar. That's the first way of reading the debate. Lema b'hakamiflige. Again, this is the exact same structure as the previous, right? Each one is, we started with the apotiki case. Each one explained it in his way, and then we said, what's the root of the debate according to this reading? So lema b'haka miflage. Is this now here? It's coming not b'mai kamiflage, which is usually right. What's the root of the machloket? It's should we say that this is like, let us suggest that this is it, and that's always going to be rejected. The root of the debate is mar savar hakesha adif or mar savar gzeira shava adifa. Is it a matter of which drasha do we prefer when we have an option of a hekesh and an option of a gzeira shava? Do we prefer the hekesh or do we prefer the gzeira shava? And that explains the two different approaches. Which the Gemara says, look, definitely not. Everybody thinks gzeira shava is a better way to go. Why is that? Remember gzeira shava? We always get it from a tradition. We don't make these things up. No logic, we could cry logical arguments, these things are juxtaposed, let's learn one from the other. But gzeira shavas are always passed down from tradition. That's always stronger. But what's the issue here? Well, sometimes gzeira shavas can be knocked out. You can knock out this kal vachomer and say, you can't compare leaving a slave relationship through a document to leaving a marriage through a document. Why is that? You can't say the same thing for a woman and an eved, because an eved can go out in some other way. And therefore, maybe, even though, since a woman can't go out in any other way, and the document's the only way, and the document is complete, okay, that's for women who get divorced. But when it comes to a slave who's getting free, there's an alternative way, and that's money. And therefore, maybe even though you might think to learn shtar from there, but we have a more closer, right? It would be weird to say, it is a little bit strange to say, there's one method in which you can be freed halfway, but the other method you can't be. It doesn't make that much sense. And that's why the juxtaposition perhaps is a stronger argument. And that's what that side says. Okay. So again, Rebbi says it works. Chachamim say it doesn't work. According to Raba, the machloket is only about a document. Everyone agrees that with money, of course, you can free half-half. The question is, does it work for a document? Do we learn it from get, or do we learn it from slaves being freed with money? So now Rav Yosef amal, machloket bekesef. De Rebbi sabar, hefdei lo niftata ptuya be'ena ptuya. Now we're going to say that this thing that was so obvious to us that everybody agreed, Rav Yosef actually thinks is a debate. Even money, it's not clear. Can you free a slave halfway? So Rebbi is obvious. You can because of the language of hefdei lo niftata, which is redeemed, not redeemed, right? Redeemed, she is not redeemed, which means she's redeemed and also not redeemed. Rabbanan savre dibrat Torah kedushan b'nei adam. That's just a matter of speaking. Redeem, not redeem, right? We wouldn't use this nowadays, but people do use that language, and they did then too. So the Torah, you can't say every extra word. It could have been written, she's not redeemed. But it also could be written this way. There's a million ways you could say the same thing. And the Torah just used the way that normal people spoke. So you can't really learn from that anything. And really all it means is she wasn't redeemed. Redeemed, she was not, means she was not redeemed. Meitive. So now we're going to have a problem. So now it seems like Rav Yosef, and then he says, "Aval b'shtar divrei kol lo kan." But according to him, a shtar for sure wouldn't work. Nobody thinks a shtar works. This is just moving everything over a level. Meitive, but wait, it says in the Braita, "Hamishachrer chatzi abdo b'shtar Rebbi omer kana chachamim omrim lo kana tiyuvta de Rav Yosef tiyuvta." This definitely knocks out Rav Yosef. The Braita says they debate an issue of shtar, and Rav Yosef just said shtar. Everyone agrees. The machloket's by money. Well, they change it all. They say b'shtaru de pligi, so they say b'shtaru de pligi because of lo pligi. Lemus having tiyuvta de Rav Yosef b'tarte. If you're going to say that, now what they're pointing out here is the difficulty on Rav Yosef here is double, because if you're going to assume that this means that they argue b'shtar and not with money, then that goes against Rav Yosef in both ways. Because by money he thinks there is no debate, but there is a debate, and this Braita seems to say there is no debate. And by shtar, he thinks there's no debate, and they think there is a debate. So it's a complete miss, right? Which would be very difficult. So Amar L'cha Rav Yosef's going to say, Pligi b'shtar v'hu adin b'kesef. I have a way to understand this Braita. He doesn't say this, they put words in his mouth. The machloket is b'shtar and also money. And then Rav Yosef is going to change what he said, which is basically, he said, the machloket is with money. He's now going to say the machloket is with shtar and money. And when the Braita said they disagree about shtar, they mean shtar and money. And they disagree across the board, and then it works out very nicely. Now, why then did the Braita just say shtar? How to come if the shtar and didn't say money? Well, to show the strength of Rebbi, that even b'shtar, he thinks it works. What do you mean? There's two sides. You could say, why we always go this way. What do you mean? Why don't you just say with money and show that even with money, the rabbis don't think it works? That would have been also. So, we'd rather say what he permits, that he permits it, Rebbi permits it even b'shtar, and therefore, okay, I'll just raise one point. It kind of came into my head when I was reading this, and then I saw that Rabbi Kiva Eger asked this question, which is this exactly a heter? Not exactly a heter. What's a heter? In other words, it's a leniency for who? To say that you can free someone halfway is not necessarily a leniency. It actually puts the slave in a very difficult position. But anyway, we'll just say that he allows this to take effect. So maybe that's toward the lenient direction in terms of the way systems work, but it's not necessarily a leniency. But anyway, means, right, we'd always rather highlight the person who's willing to permit things rather than the person who's being strict. I've seen this a whole bunch of times. Tashma, now we're going to bring questions from sources. So now we're going to first of all see the source inside where we learn this whole thing that I told you already. Vehefte, so it says she's redeemed, right? Again, redeemed, not redeemed. So first they just focus on redeemed. Well, Yachol Lakol, you could have thought she's entirely redeemed. Talmud Lomar, lo niftatav, but then move to the next words. What do you see? She's not redeemed. I lo niftatav, she's not redeemed. Yachol Lakol, you might have thought she's completely not redeemed. Talmud Lomar, behefta. Well, right, this is the confusing. Well, it says she's redeemed. It also says she's not redeemed. Ha ketzad, so how can you explain this? Duya ve'enap duya. Okay, she's redeemed and not redeemed, meaning partially redeemed. Bekesef ubeshvei kesef, either with money or something that's worth money. This is like, where do we see this? In weddings. How do we betroth people at weddings? With a ring. Now, really, what are we doing? It doesn't say you can betroth a woman with a ring. It says you can betroth a woman with money, right? Or a document or with relations. But we're using money, but it's something that's worth money. That's what they'll always ask you. Is this, did you buy it? Is it yours? Is it worth, it has to be worth a certain amount of money. So you use money. And thank you, Gita, for pointing out the Syrian Jews use coins, okay? But it's either money or something that's worth money. So that's all one and the same. So that works for money. Where do we get bishtar? That also you could do half-half. Okay, we're going to see who this matches. So first they're going to prove how do we know that hufsha lo nitana is shtar? Because it says la, and it says la by get. So therefore, it must be talking about bishtar with a document. But again, the pasuk seems to read half-half by money, entirely by shtar only. It doesn't work half-half. So chetzio bishtar minalam, where do we get half bishtar? Talmud Damar behefdei lo nifnata o chufasha lo nitana ma ki shtar lekesef ma kesef ben bekulo ben bechetzio af shtar nami ben kulo ben chetzio. So basically, it's actually funny because they're using the Gzera Shava and the Hekesh. The Gzera Shava is just to establish chufasha lo nitana as a document. From there, we say, oh, kesef is right next to shtar. From here, we prove kesef and shtar, it all works. So now the question is, who this source, that was all along Braita, that proved, first of all, it gave us the background, how we understand all these things that we kind of took for granted in the beginning of the sugya. But now we're going to see who this works out. Bishlam ala Rav Yosef, Batardi Toti. After we questioned Rav Yosef and gave the explanation that according to Rav Yosef, they argue both bishtar, both in kesef, well, then this source works perfectly because what's it saying? Money and shtar, you could do half-half. And then you would say, Reisha divrei hamani Rebbi. The entire source is Rebbi, basically. That money and shtar, according to him, Rebbi says in both cases, you can do half-half. But l'Raba, Reisha divrei hakol v'seifa Rebbi. It's a bit of a strange question because you don't really have to say this. But the assumption is that according to Rabba, the first part is all about money. Money everybody agrees with, right? According to Rabba, not according to Rav Yosef. According to Rabba, money works. So the beginning part is all according to everybody. And then the end part, which says shtar is like money, is only Rebbi, not the rabbis, because the rabbis think shtar doesn't work. So it's weird to say that the beginning part was said according to everybody, and the end part was said only according to Rebbi. To which Rav Ashi answers the obvious answer, which is Rebbi. Just because the first part could fit with the rabbis doesn't mean it's the rabbi speaking. You could say it's Rebbi speaking from the beginning, and he's just giving his whole approach, which is, it's not, the rabbis actually agree with the first part of what he said, but that's not relevant. This could be said all according to Rebbi, and that's not really a question. But now they ask the question from our Mishnah, Elamanitin, but our Mishnah, the Katani. So again, what did we do? We brought this source to try to say this works better to Rav Yosef, worse to Raba. We explained it according to Raba as well. It wasn't such a strong question. But our Mishnah that says, Misha Chetzio Evet v'Chetzio ben Chorin, Bishlam Raba Mokim La B'Kesef v'Divrei Hakol. Our Mishnah can fit with everyone according to, if you say, our Mishnah, again, this is assuming our Mishnah, Chetzio Evet Chetzio ben Chorin is someone who was partially redeemed by their master, one master. So if you say that, it works perfectly to Raba because it fits with everybody, and it's talking about money, because you can redeem a slave partially with money, according to all the opinions, only if you're Raba, though. According to Rav Yosef, that's a subject of debate. So, Ella the Rav Yosef, Lema Rebbi, below Rabbanan, you're going to have to say our Mishnah is only Rebbi and not the rabbis. And you're always better off not doing that. It's not like you can, but better off if the Mishnah matches everybody. Ella Ravina be'evet shel shnei shutafim b'divrei hakol. So the way to explain the Mishnah, according to Rav Yosef, is to say, our Mishnah is talking about two different masters, and that obviously you can do because you can free your part of the slave completely. That's a complete redemption, even though for the slave, it's not a complete redemption. From your perspective, it's complete. But still, you could say it's a subject of debate whether you can redeem your own slave part way. And then we could say the Mishnah actually matches everybody. It's just not having anything to do with this whole debate that we just discussed. So again, to review the second part of the daf, we have this famous Mishnah where Beit Hillel eventually capitulates to Beit Shamai. And in order to save these slaves and their uncertain status, we don't want to leave them in this crazy status where they can't marry. So we force them, the master, to free the slave. Again, he gets the money for the slave. It's not like he loses out. The slave has to pay his way out of this, but we do allow this. We do force the master to do this. Then we have this situation where we have a machloket. Can you partially redeem your slave? Is there a difference, money and shtar? Is there no difference? Is the debate across the board or not? We had a whole difference of opinion between Raba and Rav Yosef, how to understand the debate between the rabbis and Rebbi. Again, Rebbi says it does work. The rabbis say it doesn't work. Do they say it across the board? Does it depend on which situation? Where does all this come from? How did we get it from the Shifcha Charufa Pasuk and all the wording there? And then we tried to bring sources to question one opinion or the other, but in the end, we resolve all the difficulties. That's it for today. We'll pick up with a new section on this tomorrow. Wishing everybody a great day.